Hello students, how are you? So here I am again with you with a story that you demanded to be discussed. The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. Before we start the discussion on the story, let us revise how many genres of stories you have read before this. We started with Three Dancing Goats, a story from folklore. Then we read The Fortune Teller, a story with a twist, like you read in your journal English syllabus, The Conjurer's Revenge. Then you had Grief, a story on human psychology. Then you read The Doll's House, a story about class distinctions in society and child psychology. And here today we are with a story which falls in the category of detective fiction, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. Before we start the discussion on the story, let me tell something very interesting about the author and the character. The story has been written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he was not a writer basically, he was a doctor, a medical practitioner, and he had a taste for story writing. So he created a character, a detective, and he named it Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was modelled on one of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's teacher, and this man, Sherlock Holmes, uses some techniques to resolve a matter that Conan Doyle's teacher used to use. Then there is Sherlock Holmes' assistant, Dr. Watson, and he was modelled on one of the colleagues of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. When Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes, he had no idea that Holmes would become so popular. There came a time when Holmes became so popular that he grabbed all the attention of its creator Conan Doyle, and he was fed up with that character, and he thought of getting rid of Sherlock Holmes, and so he raised the prices of his story to a great extent. But Sherlock Holmes was so popular that the publishers who came to buy Sherlock Holmes story, they agreed to that increased price also. One thing more, usually the great writers, when they die, their birthplaces are visited by people who are their fans, and their birthplaces are their pictures and their statues. But interestingly and amazingly, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's birthplace has a statue close it, and that statue is not of Doyle but of Sherlock Holmes. So popular he was. So with the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he did not remain an imaginary character, rather became a living being, a living legend, on whose name so many films, so many stories were created, and so many portraits of Sherlock Holmes were made. Now to the story. Do you have your books with you? If you see the text, how does it start? It starts with I visited Holmes' house. So this I means that this is a first person narrative, and the narrator in the story is Dr. Watson. The story begins that Dr. Watson pays a visit to Sherlock Holmes, and when he reaches there, Holmes is examining a hat. And Holmes informs Watson that the commissioner, like Darban we say, of a hotel, his name is Peterson, had brought him that hat and a goose. So, and that hat and the goose was recovered from a man whose name was Henry Baker. Now, because the goose was of no use to Holmes, that he gives that goose to Peterson to be eaten up, and he keeps that hat for examination. Now, what is interesting here is that you would see how from the examination of the hat, he knows everything about its owner, Henry Baker. What would be his age, his haircut, his financial status, his relations with his wife, whether his house has gas or he uses candles in it, all the things. And that makes Sherlock Holmes a leading character in crime fiction. And Dr. Watson asks all the questions to him what we want to ask. That how he came to the conclusion, and that proves so right when we actually meet the man Henry Baker. So when the examination is nearly complete, examination of the hat is nearly complete, Peterson, the commissioner of the hotel that had brought him the hat, he comes and tells that the goose that Holmes had given him to be cooked for his Christmas dinner, when they cut the goose, he had found a blue carbuncle from its throat. Blue carbuncle, a very precious gem. So that makes the story very complex. Now Sherlock Holmes is reminded of a theft that has happened in a hotel. That there is a Countess Morcar, and whose blue carbuncle was stolen from his hotel room some days ago. Now, how this blue carbuncle reached from the hotel room to the goose's throat is something that Holmes has to find out. So, they give an advertisement in the paper for Henry Baker. Henry Baker turns up, and all the deductions that Sherlock Holmes had made about Baker proves right. But now question is, does Henry Baker knows about the blue carbuncle in the goose throat? To know this, Holmes tells him that his hat is there with him, but the goose had been eaten up, and he offers another goose as a substitute, which Baker is happy to receive. That means what? That Henry Baker doesn't know anything about the blue carbuncle. But the mystery must be resolved. So Holmes asks Baker from where he had bought that goose. Henry Baker names some Alpha Inn from where he has bought the goose. They pay a visit to the owner of the Alpha Inn, who tells him that he had bought that goose from a dealer in Covent Garden, and then they go to Covent Garden, and then that dealer in Covent Garden, he tells them that he had bought a number of goose, some 2 dozen of geese for the Christmas from some Mrs. Oxshott. They were planning to go to Mrs. Oxshott to know how that blue carbuncle reached that goose's throat, when there comes a man, James Ryder, and he was also wanted to know about the goose that had a black spot on his tail. Holmes at once knows that this is the man they are to meet. So he takes the man to his home, and how, without threatening, without any threat of punishment, he takes out the truth from Ryder. So how he does that, that is the story, and you are to find that through your reading. So come on, take your books, read the story, and come back to me with questions if any. Okay, good luck.